I'm going to call the speaker, so this will be very quick. Basically, Joe Rao actually got me into eclipses. A long time ago, he gave a talk, I think it was actually in Long Island, and the talk was about the plane where you hijacked and got into the path of the eclipse. So ever since then, I've been fascinated with eclipses. I've been following them. I think a lot of people here know Joe. I'm used to call weatherman. I think it's broadcast here in the Bronx, not by me in Queens, unfortunately. So, without further ado, here's Joe Rao.
You know, I'm a Bronx boy. I spent the best part of my life living in the Bronx. However, my part of the Bronx was Throgs Neck, which I always thought of as an extension of Queens. Where we are here in the Grand Concourse is truly the Bronx part of the Bronx, Arthur Avenue, for example. And I haven't been to this part of the Bronx in quite some time. In fact, I've only been around here for only a few times in all the years I've lived in the Bronx. But it's nice to be here at the Pope Park area for all of you. Tom mentioned that I hijacked the plane in 1990. I didn't really do that. What I did do is point out to an airline which now no longer exists, American Transair. This was back in 1990. There was a total eclipse of the sun. Most people went to Helsinki, Finland to observe it. However, the end of the eclipse path came right in between Honolulu, Hawaii and San Francisco, California. And I coerced or cajoled the airlines to possibly delay their flight by 41 minutes. When they did that, I said we would be in the direct path of the eclipse and would have a chance to show passengers on board a big aircraft, L-1011, 360 people on board. And at the moment when the eclipse hit total, we had people standing in the aisles 3 and 4 deep looking out, trying to get a view through the window to see a total eclipse of the sun. If you're saying to yourself now, why would anybody be so crazy as to do something like that? It's so, you probably have never seen a total eclipse of the sun. How many of you here have never seen a total solar eclipse?
I've never seen a partial or an annual, or I've only seen one lunar eclipse in my entire life.
Okay, well here we
have.
We have a young man here who's already well versed in the mechanics of a total solar. So I thought what we would do, I'm going to talk about basically eclipses. I'm also chiefly going to talk about, I hope you picked up on your seat there, in 1997, I had the opportunity to write for Reader's Digest my story about how my grandfather got me started on eclipses. And it's a funny way that story evolved. In 1996, we knew that Hale-Bopp, the great comet Hale-Bopp, was coming. I managed to get a meeting with the editorial board of Reader's Digest. I sat down and explained how great this comet was going to be. Then one of the editors said, well, you sound very, very enthusiastic. How did you get involved in astronomy? And I got to talking about my grandfather and how he showed me an eclipse of the sun when I was a very young boy. And a couple of days later, one of the editors called me up and said, well, we're going to pass on your suggestion of doing the article on the comet. And that kind of saddened me for a few seconds. And he said, well, what we really would like you to do is to write a story about how your grandfather influenced you in astronomy. And that's the story that you have here, the promise. And indeed, he promised me when I was just not quite 7 years old that he was going to take me to see a total eclipse of the sun. And he fulfilled that promise 9 years later. I thought I'd start today's talk. Mike Andrakis, who is works at CBS and unfortunately cannot be here, has access to the CBS archives, and he is able to pull any kind of film or news story from the distant past, and he was able to come up with this little piece of footage. It only lasts about a minute and a half, but it's where my story begins. And the story begins with this: July 20th, 1963, an eclipse of the sun that was visible over, whoops, I jumped right over it. Let's see if we can start from the beginning. We can't start eclipses from the beginning if we miss them. Things used to be so easier when we had ectographic slide projectors. Instead of, I once gave a talk. I was the only one who gave a talk using a slide projector at an American Meteorological Society conference many years ago. They had so much trouble with the computer, and then when I got on my slide projector, I just hit a button and all through went. This is July 20th, 1963. There was a total eclipse of the sun visible over Maine. Here in New York, it was only partial, and we got about 90% coverage. And this view is from the Empire State Building. The AAA, the group that is sponsoring this talk this morning, was on the Empire State Building with their telescopes, as we have our telescopes out there today. They were up on the Empire State Building's 86th floor observation deck, showing the general public. That's Abe Oshinsky. I knew Abe very well. He passed away some years ago with his telescope. And as you can see, there's the advancement of the moon in front of the sun. It was kind of a cloudyish, humid kind of day, but you were able to see the moon passing in front of the sun. Some people used their binoculars to project the image of the sun onto a piece of paper. We're closing in now on the maximum phase of the eclipse. And the last few frames here is New York City. A counterfeit twilight, if you will, fell over the city during the maximum phase of the eclipse, giving a weird kind of effect. There you go, there, looking south in the lower end of Manhattan. So, a few hours before that eclipse occurred, my grandfather pulled me aside and told me about this astronomical event that was coming up. And as I said, this particular instance, this particular event, I mentioned in the story that I wrote for Reader's Digest, which is called The Promise. He took me aside that morning, that Saturday morning, and said, "We're going to have an eclipse of the sun later today." What's an eclipse? I was only about 7 years old, not quite 7 years old, 6 3/4, if you will. And what is it? So he was very, very inventive. He went over to the shelf on the kitchen and got himself a salt shaker and a pepper shaker, put it on the table, used his fist. He said, "My fist is the sun, the salt shaker will be the moon, and the pepper shaker will be the earth." And I, me being a wise guy kid, even 6 years old or whatever, I said, "Grandpa, that's not the sun." He said, "What do you mean that's not the sun?" I said, "The sun doesn't have knuckles." But anyway, he demonstrated to me that when this moon got between the earth and the sun, the moon would get in the way of the sun as we see it from here on earth, and it would cause an eclipse. This, of course, is the more standard view that you would get in most astronomy textbooks, showing you the moon throwing not one but two shadows onto the surface of the earth. There is a very wide shadow that you see here, and this shadow is called the penumbra. And if you're anywhere within this outer shadow here, you will see the sun at least partially eclipsed by the moon. If you're right at the edge, for example, right about here, you'd only see a very tiny little scallop or bite taken out of the sun. If, however, you're closer to this narrow, dark strip here, you'd see a lot of the sun covered, practically all of it covered. This dark cone that you see here is the other shadow, the dark shadow, the umbra. And if that umbra happens to fall on you, you will see one of nature's great spectacles, a total eclipse of the sun. That's the place to be. You want to be in the path of the umbra to get the great show. And this is what you would be looking at if you happen to be in the totality path. You would see, of course, the moon progress across the face of the sun's disk until finally you come to that grand moment when the sun is completely covered, one of the great spectacles of nature. And when the sun is completely covered, you get to really, truly see a lot. You get to see the sun's outer atmosphere, the corona of the sun, which is still a mystery. After, it's amazing. Astronomers study the stars. We have the Hubble Space Telescope. We look at distant stars and distant galaxies. And yet here we have a star parked right next to us, 93 million miles away, and there's still mysteries about it. One of the mysteries is about that corona, the surface of the sun, the photosphere. 11,000 degrees, the core of the sun, 30 million degrees. Well, at the surface of the sun, the photosphere is 11,000 degrees. You would expect that as you pull away from the sun, that you would be getting progressively cooler. Not so, because the corona of the sun is actually even hotter than the surface of the sun, as much as 2 million degrees. Why? Astronomers are still trying to figure that out. It's why we go to eclipses, solar eclipses, because really we can create eclipses with our telescopes. We have instruments called the coronagraph, for example, that can show us the corona anytime. But if you really want to get a very good view, the best view possible, you go to see total eclipses of the sun. And astronomers travel at considerable expense, great distances, to observe eclipses of the sun. The next few pictures, I apologize for the quality of the next few pictures because they're over 40 years old. Back in 1972, my grandfather took me to my very first total eclipse of the sun. It was in Canada, on the Gaspé Peninsula. I used to say this was X number of years ago. I now instead say this was about 85 pounds ago. We went to the town of Cap-Chat, Quebec. And Cap-Chat on the Gaspé Peninsula very much at that time reminded me of Andy Griffith's fictional town of Maybury. In fact, it was Maybury, only it was in French. I swore that as we were walking through the streets of Cap-Chat, I saw Floyd the barber there, getting ready to give people a haircut in French. But it was because of my grandfather took me up. Grandfather drove myself, my grandmother, my mom, my sister, we all drove up a leisurely 900-mile drive up Interstate 87 to Montreal, and then after spending a day in Montreal, we went up to Quebec City, and then from Quebec City on the morning of the eclipse, July 10th, 1972, we traveled up the Gaspé to see this spectacular sight. But it was my grandmother who allowed us to actually see the eclipse. You see, as we arrived at Cap-Chat, we were racing a massive cloud and rain that was moving up the St. Lawrence Valley. So when we arrived at Cap-Chat, it was like a day like what we have out there right now. But as the eclipse began, the clouds started coming in. Now, if we had stayed where we were going to stay, at the hotel, I booked the hotel months and months before the eclipse, the Hotel Minuet. It was not exactly, I wouldn't say it's a sleazy little hotel, but it was a small hotel. And one of the things that you had in that hotel was, in the room, a basin. That's all you had, was a wash basin. If you wanted to use the facilities, you had to go down the hallway and share a bathroom with 6 other people or 6 other rooms on that floor. My grandmother got wind of this. She said to my grandfather, "Mario, we're not staying here. I'm not going to stay in a hotel." So we packed everything up after we had a leisurely lunch. We packed everything up and we drove out of Cap-Chat over about 3 or 4 miles away from Cap-Chat, outside of town, in this big field that you see here to watch the eclipse. Very, very lucky that we did that, because you see, if we had stayed in town, we wouldn't have seen the total eclipse. It was clouded over completely. But because we made that slight move of 3 or 4 miles outside of town, there was one teeny tiny hole in the clouds, which just happened to pass right over the sun at the moment when the eclipse was total. And so we got to see it, but all of the thousands and thousands of people from all over the United States, all over the world, who congregated in the city of Cap-Chat did not see the eclipse. Thank you, Nanny, wherever you are, for not wanting to do that. Now here's my grandfather and my grandmother. You can see how excited my grandmother was to be there. How many of you ever seen the movie Pride of the Yankees, the Lou Gehrig story with Gary Cooper? Do you remember that scene where Lou Gehrig's mother didn't want Lou Gehrig to be a ball player, she wanted him to be an engineer? You remember that scene where they go to Yankee Stadium, the two of them, the father and the mother, and there's nobody in Yankee Stadium? And they got there like 3 hours before the game, and Lou Gehrig's mother said, "Are you sure that we came to the right ballpark?" Well, everybody was in Cap-Chat waiting for the eclipse. We drove up toward Cap-Chat from Quebec City. There was nobody on the road. We're driving, northward. We didn't see anybody. And my grandmother at one point said to my grandfather he said, "Are you sure this is the right day?" And the one thing and just like Lou Gehrig's mother, when Yankee Stadium filled up just before the game, she looked at her husband and said, I don't believe it, so many people here with nothing to do. And when my grandmother, as we're driving into the eclipse track, into the path of totality, just as we got to the totality path, we saw a guy on the side of the road with his telescope. My grandmother said, "Why don't we stop here?" I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, there's another nut over here, we put in." But as we got deeper and deeper into the eclipse path, and got closer and closer to the center of the eclipse path, where the eclipse was going to last the longest, I mean, it was like multiplication. 2 became 4, 4 became 8, 8, 16, 24, 30, and until by the time we got to town, the whole town was like clogged with people. I always thought I saw Barney Fife there saying, "All right, get over here, come on, move that bar." It was unbelievable how so many people were congregating, and just like Lou Gehrig's mother, my grandmother said, "I don't believe it. So many people here just to see it get dark for 2 minutes." But as I said, we were very, very lucky because although the whole sky was pretty much clouded over and we were surrounded by clouds, there you see the sun going into total eclipse. Here I am. This was taken rather recently. I think it was taken in 2006 after I had gone to Turkey to see a total eclipse of the sun. I forgot. Now I was wearing my eclipse cap, and in fact, one of the gentlemen who created all those badges, Mr. John Beatty, John created a badge for every solar eclipse. And every time I saw a particular eclipse, I'd put the badge on the baseball cap there, and then you can see by how many eclipses I had seen. I was on a tour, actually. It was a 2-day tour that emanated out of London, England, out of Gatwick Airport. We flew from Gatwick to Turkey. We stayed the night. The next day we saw the total eclipse, and then right after the eclipse we all went back to the airport and flew back to London. So it was a 2-day whirlwind tour. The people who were on the plane that I was on, flying to Turkey, were all, for the most part, from Great Britain, from the United Kingdom. And most of these people had previously been disappointed. There was a total eclipse of the sun over England, over the United Kingdom in 1999 that was wiped out by cloud cover. A lot of people were very disappointed. But in 2006, when this 2-day tour was announced, the plane filled up. Most of these people who were disappointed in 1999 were now trying to get a second shot at seeing what a total eclipse was like by flying down to Turkey. I later learned that people in Great Britain fly to Turkey just like we fly down to Florida during the wintertime. This was an eclipse in March. What a great thing. They spend a couple of days down by the Mediterranean and see a total eclipse of the sun. Our plane left shortly after like 6 o'clock in the morning. I got to Gatwick at 5 a.m. I'm figuring there's going to be like maybe a few people in the airport. Who was in the airport at 5 o'clock in the morning? The plane was filled, the airport was filled with people, mostly families, moms, dads. I saw one little girl, she must have been like 4 years old. She didn't know what the heck was going on, but the parents, I guess, wanted to give her a chance to see this great event. And she's walking around with her dolly. So it was like a whole family affair on board that flight as we're flying down to Turkey. Now, you see a guy like this, with all these badges and all these eclipses that he's seen, you figure he's been around the block a few times. One gentleman came up to me on board that flight and said to me, "Excuse me, sir, can I bother you for a few seconds?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Sure, what would you like?" "Well, mate, let me ask you a question." By the way, they really talk like that in Great Britain. I said, I was about 6 months ago, I was in Madrid, and I saw the Ring of Fire. What was he talking about? Well, I knew exactly what he was talking about. 6 months earlier, over parts of Europe, right over the city of Madrid, Spain, there was an annular eclipse. And in recent years, the parlance has been, not to call this an annular eclipse, they call it the Ring of Fire. What is this? Well, this is the moon. But you know, the moon is not at the same distance from the Earth. It sometimes gets very close to the Earth. When it's very close to the Earth and it's a full moon, they call it the supermoon. But sometimes it can go way out, 30,000 miles further out in space, in which case the moon, when it's lined exactly up with the sun, cannot cover the sun completely. This is kind of like a penny on nickel effect. Figure the moon is the penny, the nickel is the sun, and when the sun and moon are exactly aligned, you have this, a ring of fire in the sky. And this gentleman had seen the Ring of Fire in Madrid 6 months earlier. And so he asked me, as we were flying toward Turkey for the total eclipse that was coming the next day, he said, I saw the Ring of Fire eclipse. It was a great affair. Now, could you tell me, tomorrow when we are going to be in Turkey and when we're going to see the total, will the total eclipse be as good a show as what I saw in Madrid 6 months ago? And I must have had this sudden look of incredulity on my face. Like, what, are you crazy? I looked at the guy and I said, "Mister, you ain't seen nothing yet." He said, "You compared an annular eclipse to a total." He said, forget about that. You're going to see something tomorrow that's going to be special. And he looked at me, a similar look of incredulity, and he said, "Really?" said, well, I thought it was a really wonderful sight, a ripping good show. I said, you come back tomorrow when we're back on this plane and you tell me what you think of the annular versus what you're going to see tomorrow. And sure enough, we saw the total eclipse. It was a magnificent sight, 3 minutes and 15 seconds, a gorgeous corona seen right on the shores of the Mediterranean. Well, the gentleman came back on the plane and he saw me, we saw each other. I called him over and I said, all right, so what'd you think? What'd you think of it? And he said, well, the ring of fire was cute. And he knew then that he finally had a chance to bask in the shadow of the moon. A similar story. This is what I do when I give talks. I suddenly think of things, like deviate off for a few moments. I have another friend who always hears when I give a talk about total eclipse, and I always talk about how spectacular it is, how amazing it is. And he came up to me one time and he said, you're pushing this. You talk about a total eclipse of the sun. I know what a total eclipse of the sun is like. It's like a big, severe thunderstorm. The only difference is you don't get wet, there's no lightning, there's no thunder. But that's about it, right? I said, no, it's not that. It's so much more than just getting dark. But he never could understand the concept of that. Well, several months after our most recent talk, he found himself on a business trip in Orlando, Florida, and it just happened that night they were launching the space shuttle. And you could see the space shuttle, especially at night, from Orlando, even though you're like 50 miles away. He came back after that viewing of the space shuttle at night, and he's like, he couldn't stop talking. He said, oh my God, it was unbelievable. The sky lit up, and the sound came 30 seconds afterwards. It was unbelievable. And they were following all the way out, whatever. And it's just amazing. He said, Joe, I know you've seen these things. He said, it's so much more than what you see when you see it on television. And I looked at him with a smile and I said, really? I said, you know what I've been telling you about a total eclipse of the sun? I said, it's so much more. Do you get the idea now what I'm trying to tell you about a total eclipse of the sun? And I think it finally sunk in. And he's going to see the next one in the United States, only a couple of years from now. And he said, all right, I'll get it. And I said, well, by the way, Bill, I said, just for your point of reference, what you saw with the space shuttle going up at night, a total eclipse of the sun is at least 100 times better than that event. And Bill looked at me and he said, really? I said, but I saw the space shuttle go up at night. I said, that was a hell of a show, Joe. A hell of a show, by the way, is a ripping good show in England, right? It was a hell of a show. I said, when you see your first eclipse in 2017, the one that's going to go across the United States, come back and we'll discuss it at later. I know I'm going to win that conversation as well. Here it is, by the way. The next one, less than 28 months away. I saw the last one in the United States, the continent of the lower 48 states, back in 1979 from Roy, Montana. And that night, a bunch of us sat around the TV and watched Walter Cronkite with the CBS Evening News. And he talked about the sun going out today. And the next total eclipse of the sun over the United States won't be for 38 years. He had a smile on his face, because Walter knew he was probably not going to be around in 38 years. In the year 2017, August 21st of the year 2017. And that was 38 years, more than 38 years away. Well, guess what, folks? It's only 28 months away now. And here it is. The path of the eclipse is going to start over the Pacific Ocean, and then it will cut southeastward. It'll enter the coastline of Oregon. Moving at about 2,000 plus miles per hour, this shadow will traverse the entire U.S. in 90 minutes, much faster than even the Concorde could go. It'll go right across the country. It'll pass over the nation's heartland. It'll go, part of it will pass over Kansas City and St. Louis, and then it will exit the United States at Charleston, South Carolina. And right there where you see greatest eclipse, that's where the eclipse will last the longest, 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Now, the eclipse is going to go over 14 states, or parts of 14 states. 12 million people, by my estimate, are fortuitously located in that purplish path, the path of totality. You see here, it's darker immediately adjacent to the path on either side, right here and right here. That's the zone where you get at least 80% coverage of a partial eclipse, 80% or more. It also delineates the zone where you're within a 1 day's drive of seeing totality. There are 200 million people within that one-day drive zone. And let me tell you something, it's 28 months away, but a goodly number of hotels have already been booked along that eclipse track. And let me tell you something else, most of the people who booked out those hotels come from Europe, come from Japan, come from all parts of the world. I said to, I was at an astronomy conference last week in Rockland County, and I spoke to one of the editors of Sky and Telescope magazine, and he said, he laughed, he said, you know, it's going to be funny, he says, it's going to happen on our own turf, and all Americans will be booked out because all the hotels will be booked out by people from all over parts of the country. So you might want to consider thinking about seeing this event now while it is. New York City will not be, will probably be within a little bit more than a day's drive. My plans are just to make sure about 10 days or so beforehand, the part of the path which is going to be probably at the best chance of seeing the eclipse based upon weather, and then knowing that probably I wouldn't be able to get a hotel room in the eclipse track, I'll probably just fly out somewhere, like let's say over here in Utah or maybe Montana, rent a car and then travel by car into the eclipse zone. That's going to be a big event, folks. 2017, you may not hear about it now, but when we get closer to that event, that's going to be one of the big events of 2017. This is a picture of my grandfather. Of course, he looks a lot younger than 1972. This is probably taken back around the 30s, early 30s. He was a bus driver by day, but he was also an architectural designer at night. That's how he made his money. But in 1925, at the age of 16, he saw a total eclipse of the sun. The total eclipse of the sun that he saw was right here in the New York metropolitan area, January 24th, 1925. The first announcement of this event was on the front page of the New York Times on December 15th, 1923. This doesn't look like much of an article, but you know, they would put little boxes on the front page of the Times back in those days. And here it is, eclipse of the sun to darken New York for 1 minute. The announcement was made by Professor Henry Norris Russell, head of the Department of Astronomy at Princeton University. This is December 15, 1923, so we're just over a year away from this event. And this was the first announcement to the general public at large that, hey, there's going to be a total eclipse of the sun, make your plans accordingly. Well, here's the eclipse path. It started actually here on Red Bay in northern Minnesota, went across the Great Lakes, headed southeastward, swooped across Buffalo and Binghamton, New York, passed through the New York tri-state area, enveloped all of Long Island, and then moved out to sea. What a waste. All of this total eclipse, unless you happen to be on a boat or a trawler and happen to be right in the eclipse track, finally coming to an end just to the north of Scotland in the New Hebrides Island area. A close-up view here of the eclipse shows you a little bit better what we're talking about. This is the northern limit of the eclipse. Here is the southern limit. This is the middle or center line of the eclipse. So it passed, the center line passed very close to Buffalo, very close to Oswego, Binghamton, then down toward Poughkeepsie, and continued out. Montauk Point was right in the center of the eclipse track, and then out to sea. Also, it was visible as a total across much of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard. But take a look here, the southern limit. This is the edge of totality right here. And notice where the southern limit is. Well, it's right over, it looks like right over Manhattan Island. So, this is how it all played out. If you wanted to see a total eclipse and you lived in New York City, and if you lived in lower Manhattan, or if you lived in Brooklyn, or a large part of Queens, you would have to be consoled with a 99.9% partial eclipse. And let me tell you, you really, to get the full effect of an eclipse of the sun, you've got to get rid of all of the sun. Even the slightest little bit of sunlight that is evident is still giving off a tremendous amount of light. You'd be amazed. I've talked to people over the years, well, I'm going to stay where I was in Hawaii for an eclipse in 1991. It was only going to be seen as a total from the big island of Hawaii. Well, on the smaller island of Oahu is where Honolulu is. Honolulu was going to get like 98%. And I remember I was booking into a hotel. I was on a boat, and we left Honolulu for this eclipse cruise. And I remember standing in line, and somebody had mentioned the eclipse, and this woman said, "Oh, well, I'm we're gonna see what, 97, 98% here? 98% is good enough for me. And I tapped the woman on the shoulder because I was waiting to check in. And I said, ma'am, I said,